Breaking news. Professor John Mearsheimer warns that the West must brace for an ugly Russian victory in Ukraine. Professor John Mearsheimer does not fit the stereotype of the armchair warrior. He stands apart from the rest. To begin with, he has a degree in military science from the prestigious West Point. Second, he served in the U.S. Army and rose to the rank of colonel before returning to academia to write and instruct in the field of political science. Finally, in his book The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he predicted that the United States and China would eventually clash because of the usual rising power, status quo power tension, making him one of the few remaining established scholars of neorealism with a strong voice. More than anything else, however, he stands as a symbol of the neo-realists' paradoxical antipathy toward war. These are the same academics and military leaders responsible for driving up global spending on nuclear weapons. The nuclear arsenal is the theoretical concept's real-world realization. Realists, in contrast to liberal internationalists, some of whom are members of the neocons, have historically opposed every war the United States has fought, beginning with Vietnam and continuing to the present day. These considerations led Intervention to grant the interview, conducted by Alex Lowe of SCMP, despite some back and forth over whether or not the piece should be reproduced. Though he obviously isn't correct about everything, the principles he lays out are worth considering. Get a kick out of the chat? War will drag on, John Mearsheimer tells My Take, exclusively, and any truce will at best lead to a cold peace, with significant gains for Russia. Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and current holder of the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Chair in Political Science John Mearsheimer has been called one of the most prominent critics of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, by The Atlantic. He has been providing insightful, if divisive, analysis of the conflict that has thrown the European Union into its deepest crisis since the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. And more specifically since the war in Ukraine more than a year ago. During an interview with My Take, he expressed pessimism about the possibility of peace in Europe, China's role in the conflict, and the impact that Taiwan would have as a flashpoint in the growing rivalry between Beijing and Washington. A lot of wishful thinking surrounded the mutiny in Western countries. A lot of people were crossing their fingers that it would be enough to depose Vladimir Putin. This would be a huge help for Ukraine and the West in their fight against Russia. However, that did not occur. Putin will actually benefit from the uprising. His power will grow as a result of the rebellion. The Wagner Group and Yevgeny Prigozhin in particular did not have a good rapport with the military, which is why they decided to leave. You cannot effectively manage a military force without a well-thought-out chain of command. Prigozhin was a dangerous free spirit. Prigozhin was ultimately fired, and the Wagner Group was set to fall under military control. The Russian military would be strengthened by this. It's crucial to keep in mind that sending a nation's armed forces into battle after a long period of peace is something they haven't done in quite some time. The Russian military is no exception to this rule. In the beginning, there will be a lot of issues to deal with. However, as the war progresses, these issues are eventually resolved. Then there is some justification for having a military. What occurred with the Wagner Group is an instance of military inefficiency being reduced through rationalization. In the end, Russia's armed forces will be stronger, which is a positive development. Is there hope for a lasting peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine? While a negotiated peace may be possible in some conflicts, that is not the case here. There is no way out, and there are two major roadblocks that make a lasting peace agreement extremely unlikely. Please hear me out on this. You will not get a real peace agreement, but you will get a ceasefire that turns into a cold conflict. There are two explanations for this. Both are related to the question of territory and to the concept of neutrality. Now that they have occupied and formally annexed a large chunk of Ukrainian territory, the Russians have made it abundantly clear that they have no intention of returning it to Ukraine. The Ukrainians rightly see this as unacceptable. They are determined to regain control of their historic homeland at any cost. You can't find a middle ground between Russia and Ukraine on the issue of territory, as either Russia keeps the territory or Ukraine gets the territory. That is a circle that cannot be squared. Neutrality is the other intractable problem. The Russians are dedicated to keeping Ukraine out of NATO and maintaining its status as a neutral state. This is crucial to the Russians, and I think it was the main motivation for Russia to enter the conflict. Whether Ukraine remains an independent nation or joins NATO is at issue. The Ukrainians, reasonably enough, demand assurances of safety. They're looking for some nation or coalition of nations to guarantee their safety. And only the NATO nations have the resources to provide that. Obviously, Ukraine is not a neutral state if it is either de jure or de facto a member of NATO. The Russians will not tolerate such a scenario. Therefore, the neutrality problem cannot be resolved in a way that would be acceptable to both the Ukrainians and the Russians. You're dealing with two problems that can't be fixed. Therefore, I contend, you will not achieve a substantial peace agreement and, at best, will experience a cold conflict. A ugly victory for Russia is what you're expecting. Please elaborate on what you mean. If Russia were to ultimately conquer all of Ukraine, that would be considered a decisive victory. Some have speculated that Russia's goal all along was to incorporate it into its larger territory. Russia will not prevail in a decisive way. All of Ukraine will not fall to them. However, Ukraine will lose significant territory. The Russians will expand their territory gains beyond the current 23%. It is my estimation that they will succeed in taking over 43% of Ukraine. By the end of it all, they will control the Crimean Peninsula as well as 8 oblasts, regions, which is a sizable chunk of land, almost half. Ukraine will be reduced to a dysfunctional rump state that cannot wage a major war against Russia and does not meet the requirements to join the European Union or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's what I anticipate the final outcome to be. There will be a chilly truce between the two sides once you reach your destination. The Ukrainians will be very unhappy and will try to undo it in any way they can. The West will work with them to try to destabilize the icy calm. The Russians will, of course, do whatever it takes to destabilize Ukraine, will have abysmal relations with the West, and will go to extraordinary lengths to stir up trouble in the West. As a result, we are confronted with a bleak outlook for the future. When do you think they will reach what you call a cold peace, and how long will that take? That's a challenging question with no easy solution. With the information we currently possess, it is difficult to conceptualize the sheer number of casualties sustained by both sides. Both the Ukrainians and the West have an interest in spreading false information about the severity of the situation in Ukraine. Still, I believe that a hot war will last for another 2 years before giving way to a cold peace. It is possible, and I would argue likely, that the cold peace will once again turn into a hot war because the Ukrainians and the West will not be satisfied with the ugliness of the victory the Russians achieved. What role does China play in this scenario? In my opinion, China comes out on top in this war. The United States has a strong interest in shifting its focus to East Asia in order to keep China at bay. The United States government sees China as a more significant threat than Russia. The United States must recognize China as a competitor on equal footing. The United States faces a new and different kind of threat from China than it did from Russia. The United States has an interest in avoiding a protracted conflict in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine. In addition, they have an incentive to prevent Russia and China from becoming close allies. The conflict in Ukraine has made it extremely difficult for the United States to fully pivot to Asia. The Americans have broken first rule of balance of power politics by foolishly pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. For the Chinese, this is like finding a treasure trove. From Beijing's perspective, the best-case scenario involves the war continuing unabated, Russia avoiding defeat, and the United States remaining deeply committed and frustrated in Europe, rendering it unable to focus on China and win the Russians away from the Chinese. Many people are confident in the United States' ability to triumph. Upon defeating the Russians, they will have the freedom to travel to East Asia and bolster Taiwan's defenses, ensuring that the island forever remains a quasi-independent state, much to China's chagrin. Many Washingtonians hope for exactly that. The United States, in my opinion, will not achieve a military victory in Ukraine, and as a result will become mired in Europe. That means fewer resources for the United States to devote to planning for Taiwan's defense and developing an appropriate alliance framework. I also think weapons destined for Taiwan are instead being shipped to Ukraine. Not every weapon, but a few.